to our second part of the Ancient Mediterranean unit. This next series of lectures will be on ancient Egypt. So we covered typically two periods within ancient Egyptian history for the AP curriculum. That's the Old Kingdom and the New Kingdom. There is a Middle Kingdom, yes, but we don't really talk about it because it's relatively short and none of our AP artworks come from that period. So as we saw with ancient Mesopotamia, these ancient civilizations are super relying on these massive waterways for a lot of the vitality and the well-being of these emerging nations and cities and states. So the Nile River is basically the backbone, almost literally, of ancient Egyptian civilization. Water from Lake Victoria, which is kind of in Central Africa and is supplied by melting snow, flows northward down the Nile River and then into the Mediterranean Sea. So this is sometimes a little bit difficult for students to understand. The northern part of Egypt is called Lower Egypt, and the southern part of Egypt is called Upper Egypt. So a lot of students are confused by this. It's because this is the direction that the Nile is flowing. It flows from south to north into the Mediterranean Sea. So even the regional designations of this nation are defined based on the flow of the Nile. So that's something to keep in mind. So one of the reasons that the Nile is such a vital part of ancient Egypt is the annual flooding of the Nile Delta as well as the surrounding lands. So this is a great diagram right here that kind of illustrates everything that's within a close proximity to the Nile River is fertile. These are the Kemet or black lands, and they're called black lands because of the nutrient-rich silt that is being brought down the Nile. So this is the stuff that is fertilizing all of the plants and providing this nutrient-rich basis for this river ecosystem. And pretty much anything that's not within direct contact of the Nile River is the red lands or the desert. So this is basically the only reason that civilization can be here is because of the Nile River and the resources that it provides. There's also lots of travel that's happening down the Nile as well that is facilitating travel and trade and so on. We'll get more into that in a little bit. So the ancient Egypt as we know it, as this kind of monolithic civilization, lasted for about 3,000 years. So it's kind of difficult to describe how much time that is. So one of the things I do is I say this is 15 times longer than the United States has been around as a country. So, and the thing that's remarkable about ancient Egypt is that throughout these 3,000 years, Egypt was relatively stable. We saw in the Egypt Mesopotamia lecture that these lands were changing hands and names constantly because there were so many squabbles over them. Whereas ancient Egypt has its periods of discord and chaos, but relatively speaking, it remains quite stable. And it wasn't regularly conquered by foreign powers until around 1000 BCE. That's when we start seeing the Assyrians, the Persians, and the Romans coming in. So another thing that a lot of people kind of forget about ancient Egypt is its influence on artwork that is happening in the northern part of the Mediterranean. So a lot of people tend to assume that ancient Greece and ancient Rome are the birthplaces of modern Western art. This is not consistent with the evidence that we have coming down through art history. So an example of this are basically the conventions of human figures. So the ancient Egyptians produced these quite canonized human figures in these very rigid positions where you have one foot in front of the other and the arms down to the side. It's very upward posture. This is typically called a pharaoh pose. And some of the earlier artwork that we're seeing out of ancient Greece is almost exactly the same as these kinds of sculptures. So we're seeing a clear influence here. And based off of the time periods, we have to assume that the Greeks are being influenced by the Egyptians here. So another thing that's really remarkable about Egyptian art is that it remains remarkably consistent throughout its history. So these are two pieces right here of a pharaoh in a smiting pose, basically holding a mace or a club about to strike an enemy's head. And these were created 2,000 years apart. 2,000 years apart. And they look remarkably similar. This is a sunken relief and this is a raised relief, but the image is virtually the same. So that's one of the things that it's one of the reasons that ancient Egyptian artwork is so recognizable is that it's very canonized. The ancient Egyptians also had a writing system. You've probably seen them before. They're called hieroglyphs. You can see a couple of them in the top right of this image right here. They're basically these pictographic symbols that correspond to sounds. You string some of those sounds together and then you end up with complete words. So it kind of works like katakana in Japanese. The seat of power in ancient Egypt were the pharaohs or kings. They are seen as sacred and godlike, descended from these lines of deities and gods. They were oftentimes seen as gods on earth, and they were treated accordingly. So one thing that's also important to remember about ancient Egypt is that they probably produced a lot of art that does not survive currently because it was lost in some way, shape, or form. So most of the artwork that comes down to us that we know of has been found in tombs and burial sites, and it has been preserved and sealed away from the elements, which is why we happen to have it now. So there is a clear bias here in terms of the artworks that are being made, so that's just something to keep in mind. So most of the artworks, I believe all of them that we're seeing in this unit, are really emphasizing these themes of death, rebirth, and the afterlife. So in terms of materials and resources, ancient Egypt is pretty different from ancient Mesopotamia. For one thing, the ancient Egyptians have lots of different kinds of stone available to them, which is allowing them to create those gigantic pyramids. They also have some access to wood. They're still importing wood from other places such as Syria, but there's a lot of local species that are perfect for building things like coffins and statues. So stone was primarily shaped using tools, and then you could sand it down with literal sand. The ancient Egyptians were also pretty well known for their metalwork and jewelry. A lot of ancient pharaohs and pharaohs' wives were buried with their finest jewelry, oftentimes using gold and silver alloys. There's also this material called faience, which is this turquoise blue substance that is made out of quartz, and then it can actually be cast in molds like glass. So there's several different colors of faience. Another thing that's important to note is that like a lot of the stuff that is coming down through ancient Egypt is thousands of years old. And remarkably, we have some objects that are made of wood from this time period. There is, again, a sort of bias for wood in discoveries because this is a very dry climate. So there's not going to be as much bacterial activity that's going to be degrading the wood. So we do tend to see a lot more wood artifacts in these environments where there's not going to be conditions that are degrading the wood. So unfortunately, I had to break down this diagram into two pieces, but it's a really good visual illustration of basically who's having control over ancient Egypt as we know it, and basically like how the power is rising throughout the dynastic period, reaching the zenith in the New Kingdom, and then we have these foreign influences that are coming in and taking over the land, and then eventually diminishing the influence and power of ancient Egypt as we know it. So the period that we talk about in the AP curriculum is the early dynastic period all the way through to the New Kingdom. So we're only really talking about this period right here. So before this, ancient Egypt consists of a lot of more kind of like individual prehistoric settlements, these that are more independent. There's not really like a unified power. That doesn't really happen until King Narmer in the early dynastic period. And then after the fall of the New Kingdom, we have these foreign powers that are controlling most of ancient Egypt. So this is our first kingdom. We have these four. powers that are controlling most of ancient Egypt. So this is our first artwork, and this is King Narmer, who was the first sort of pharaoh of Egypt as a nation. So this is actually intended to be a larger commemorative version of a makeup palette. So you've probably seen images of ancient Egyptians or reconstructions where they have this black eyeliner over their eyes. So this is very similar to the function of the black lines underneath the eyes of football players and other sports people to basically prevent the glare from blinding them. So that it served a similar function in ancient Egypt as well. So there is actually a recess on the back of this palette that is round, where you basically grind up the powder that was used for the eye makeup that you could then kind of like have in the recess and then use for eye makeup. So this is a much larger version of that relatively small kind of like makeup mirror-sized tool. So there is a narrative that is being shown here. We have King Narmer, who you'll notice is the largest figure and tallest figure by far in this composition. He is holding a mace in his right hand, and in his left hand there is a fallen enemy who he is about to murder. There's also a little dude over here on his own separate platform. This is a sandal bearer. So this is basically the guy that carries all of Narmer's stuff around, including his shoes. And then there's also some figures down here that might be conquered enemies. So I'm going to go through a couple of the other symbols and motifs in the following slides. So this is an example of a narrative, particularly the narrative of the creation of dynastic Egypt. So before Egypt was unified under these dynastic rules, they were separated into Upper Egypt and Lower Egypt, which we saw on these slides here. And this unification effort was facilitated over this span of what was likely several decades, particularly by King Narmer. So these are events that are happening over a long period of time, but based on what we're seeing in this narrative, it seems like things are happening kind of simultaneously. So again, we have this hierarchy of scale. The figures that are the largest are typically the most important. There's also some hieroglyphs on this piece. There's some right here as well as some right here. We're not quite sure what this means, but we know that this symbol up here of a catfish and a chisel means Narmer. So what you also notice too is that there are registers. So remember the standard of from a previous lecture where there are these narrative bands that are basically ground lines for figures to stand on. We're seeing one of them right here for Narmer and the enemy, and then another one for his sandal bearer right here. So this is the front of the palette right here. So we're seeing the same motif of this horned goddess figure on both sides of the palette. We're not entirely sure if she's Bot or Hathor. There is we also have this motif of Narmer's name right here. In this particular narrative, again, we're seeing Narmer, who is the largest figure on this register, his sandal bearer, as well as a priest, and then they're bearing these standards. So these are basically like ritual items that are carried in a procession. There's also this particularly grisly image on the right here of decapitated and castrated enemies that have been lined up. There's also another interesting motif on this bottom register right here of a bull and a man, and it looks like they're infiltrating the walls of the city. So there might be this comparison of Narmer has the strength of a bull in that he is going in and like knocking down the walls of the city. These two creatures right here with the long necks are referred to as serpent leopards, and they are intertwining their necks to create the recess in this makeup palette. So again, here's the front with all of the important things helpfully labeled. This figure over here too, like falcons feature pretty prominently in ancient Egyptian mythology. They represent the god Horus, who appears pretty frequently and usually represents the sun. This is our next piece, the Seated Scribe. So this statuette is around 1.5 feet tall, and it was buried in a tomb in Saqqara in Lower Egypt. So you'll notice that it is a painted sculpture, which is quite remarkable given that it's at least 4,500 years old. You saw in our previous lectures that we have a lot of statues from classical antiquity that are around 2,000 years old or 2,500 years old, and their paint has been completely worn away. So this statue was around 2,000 years older than that and still has the paint on it. So it was this was primarily because it was preserved in a tomb. It was sealed away from the elements, so it's in remarkable condition. So statuettes like this were usually referred to as shakti, and they were created to accompany a high-ranking individual in death. So in a lot of cultures, essentially when a rich person died, they would have some sort of there was usually this overarching belief that they would go into the next world and live a pretty similar life that they did previously, and that they would need stuff in order to carry on their lifestyle. And one of those things, of course, is servants. So in some cultures, they would just kill a couple of dozen people and like bury them with the important person, and that would be kind of like the way of them carrying their servants into the afterlife. In some situations, there's a bit more of a more merciful way of doing that, and that was by burying these figures that were intended to represent servants. So a scribe was something that was particularly important in ancient Egypt. This is basically a dude that is writing down all the cool things you did, so that you have a legacy. So what you'll notice too in this figure is that he's not in peak physical condition. When you look at statues of other figures, particularly pharaohs, they have almost this Dorito-shaped body. They are in peak physical condition. They're very fit-looking. Their faces are very symmetrical. They don't really have any body fat from what we can see. But when we look at this figure, he's quite lifelike. He has these kind of this sagging chest. He's not particularly toned. He's a scribe. He's kind of like a nerd. So the image is not a portrait either. This is not representing any one person, but rather an idealized scribe. Like if you are having a scribe in the afterlife, this is what you want him to look like. He is the perfect scribe. He's ready to go. His eyes are open and attentive. His back is straight. He has a stylus in his hand. He's ready to go. He also has a slab of papyrus right here in his hand. So papyrus is this material that is made out of the papyrus plant. You basically cut it into sheets and then you can hammer it. You bake it together and then you hammer it flat and let it dry. And this is basically ancient paper. And a lot of records were written on papyrus. So there was a stylus in his hand as well that he was using to write. It has since been lost. Our next piece is the Great Pyramids and Great Sphinx of Giza. So these were massive monuments and tombs dedicated to deceased pharaohs. So there were three pharaohs that basically commissioned these massive pyramids. And what's super funny to me is that Menkaure was the first one. He probably thought when he had this pyramid built, like, this thing is super great, like nobody's ever gonna be able to top this. And then his descendant, Khafre, was like, you know what, I'm gonna make an even bigger pyramid so I can show up my ancestry to show how important I am. And then Khufu was like, you know what, my pyramid is going to be even bigger and even taller. So there's this kind of like pettiness that we're seeing in terms of like everybody wants to be bigger and greater than the person before them. So what's interesting about the pyramids is that they actually look a lot different today than they did at the time that they were constructed. This is a reconstruction of what the pyramids actually looked like. They were covered in this white limestone facing that was actually polished so that it was shiny. So you can imagine you're in the middle of the desert and you look up and you see this super shiny, almost blindingly white, 480-foot tall structure that is topped with gold. This is going to be something that is absolutely like jaw-slackingly inspiring, and like you look at this thing and you're like, oh my gosh, like I believe in the power of the gods and of the might of the pharaoh. So unfortunately, a lot of the stone facing fell off over several subsequent earthquakes, and then a lot of people came and collected the stones and then used them in their own buildings. So the pyramids are likely modeled off of the shape called the Benben, which was the symbol of the cult of Ra. So Ra is the Egyptian god of the sun. You can imagine that the sun has a place of significance within ancient Egyptian mythology, as we saw with the ancient Mesopotamians. So each pyramid has an accompanying causeway, so basically like a catwalk, and a mortuary temple at the very end. So basically what happened when a pharaoh died was that he would be, there was this very systematic process of embalming him and preparing him for the afterlife. So a lot of his major organs would be preserved, his body would be dipped in natron salt for 40 days. Like it was this whole thing. And then there was this massive procession that took him from the place where he was embalmed to his final resting place, which was in one of these pyramid tombs. So it was this big thing, like pharaohs, like people that were organizing these funerals would hire mourners that would like scream and tear out their hair. It was basically like a party to celebrate the passage to the next world. And there was this massive procession, and these are what these structures were built for, was this funeral. A couple of these pyramids also have smaller pyramids. In one case, too, there's mastabas, which are basically like step pyramids next to them. These are usually for the queens. Oops. So the mortuary temples and pyramid entrances were always directed east. So this is the direction of the sunrise. So this is really important. We have like the sunrise and then the sun setting in the west. Again, the sun is operating as a pretty significant role in ancient Egyptian mythology. So you can imagine that the Great Pyramids and the Great Sphinx are requiring an extraordinary amount of labor and effort to create. So each of the limestone blocks used, in the construction of the Great Pyramids weighed about 5,000 pounds or more, and there were hundreds of thousands of blocks that were used to construct each pyramid. So there's actually been some archaeological evidence found of building foundations near the pyramids, where up to 4,000 skilled laborers would have worked and lived for several years during the construction of the pyramids. There's also evidence of these man-made canals that were built to basically connect the main body of the Nile to this location, and these canals were built so that they could get these stone blocks from a quarry several miles away down the river and used to construct the pyramids. So there were all of these innovations that were made to construct these pyramids. So you can imagine how like important these were to these people, that they're going through all this trouble to build this massive towering structure in the middle of the desert. So the tallest of the pyramids, the Khufu pyramid, is about 480 feet high. So we wouldn't see a taller man-made structure until the medieval era, around 3,800 years later. So this is an extremely significant development in human history. The Sphinx is another addition to this particular collection of buildings. This was carved on site from a massive piece of limestone in situ, and it represents this composite human animal figure. We have the body of a lion or a cat, and then the head of a man. So cats were seen as sacred in Egypt. You could actually be put to death if you accidentally killed one. People shaved off their eyebrows and horning when their cats died. There were several gods, including the goddess Bastet, that were associated with cats. So they occupied this position of power and significance in ancient Egyptian mythology. So you'll notice that the Sphinx has portions of its face and nose missing. There's some evidence that they were deliberately removed. So this might have been an ancient example of iconoclasm. So the Great Sphinx was actually once covered in red pigment to stand out against the desert. So we have these towering white pyramids topped with gold and this rust red Sphinx kind of standing and guarding them right here. This is our final piece for the day. This is a gray-whack portrait of King Menkaure and a female figure that might be a queen or a goddess. We're not entirely sure. So this is a high relief sculpture. It was a subtractive sculpture, so it was once one large piece of gray-whack and then portions were removed. It was designed in a way that the negative space could be relatively conserved so that there was no hollowing out of the space between the figures or the figures' legs and arms. So the male figure has been identified as Menkaure, who is the first Jew to build a pyramid in this arrangement here. The female figure could be either one of his queens or a goddess. We're not entirely sure. What's interesting is that she has this affectionate gesture. She has one arm on his bicep and the other curled around his waist. So it's a gesture of affection. There's physical contact, but their faces are still relatively blank and placid, and they're not looking at each other, but rather straight ahead. So there's this kind of like strange to us relationship of physical intimacy and affection that is being implied here. What's also interesting is that the figures are a similar height. So we know from other art examples from ancient Egypt that height and scale are pretty important. So this relatively similar height might suggest a similar, like a sharing of power, or this notion that the figures are of equal status. So you'll also notice that the male figure is quite idealized. His face is ageless, he's lean and muscular, as I mentioned previously. He's got a bit of a Dorito body going, and he's standing in this canonized pharaoh pose with the hands clenched in fists at the waist and one foot placed in front of the other, with their backs straight and they're very stout and rigid. So this particular statue might have served as a vessel for the Ka, or spirit, after the pharaoh died. So basically, the mythos is that when a person dies, then their Ka, or their spirit, goes on a journey and kind of gets lost, and then upon mummification, the Ka then recognizes the spirit again and inhabits the body, and that's what facilitates the move into the afterlife. So this is something that is intended to be timeless and eternal. So this statue was probably originally painted based off of evidence that we have, and that the intent was that the paint would wear away over time to reveal the gray whack, this dark black stone underneath. So the color black, particularly for skin, was significant to the ancient Egyptians. The god Osiris, who is basically like the king of the gods, is oftentimes depicted with this dark green or black skin, there's a lot of references to like the color of the Nile silt. So there's this notion that there's this emulation of Osiris, who is the king of the gods and also one of the reigning figures of the underworld in this particular work.
If you struggle with focus, this sound might change everything.
What's up? Let me skip the side.
Where we left off last time in the Old Kingdom. Ancient Egypt as we know it, which is the New Kingdom. So one of the major things that is happening at the beginning of the New Kingdom is the transition of the capital from Lower Egypt to Upper Egypt. So this is where we see a lot of things from the Old Kingdom is in Lower Egypt, in Saqqara and Giza. Remember that Lower Egypt is in the north and Upper Egypt is in the south because of the direction of the Nile. And then we're starting to see more monuments and important things popping up in Thebes, Luxor, and Amarna, including the Valley of the Kings. So whenever you see like images of Tutankhamun and whatever, and there's like pyramids in the background, that is not accurate because the pyramids are over here and Tutankhamun is down here. So at this point in time, the ancient Egypt is at its zenith. This is its height of power. It's expanded its borders to the farthest that we're going to go, all the way to the Euphrates River in the northeast and to Nubia in the south. Of course, at this height of power, the ancient Egyptian pharaohs are going to be constructing these massive monuments to commemorate their wealth and their power, as well as the this eternal ever presence of their gods. So this temple is associated with Amun-Ra, and it is around a fifth of a mile long. It is quite massive. It was added to over several hundred years by various pharaohs, and it follows what we call in our history an axial plan. So kind of think of like the planet Earth, how there's a central axis that runs from the North Pole to the South Pole, and there's symmetry, relatively speaking, that goes around this axis. So think of an axis kind of going down the center of this plan right here, dividing it into two roughly symmetrical halves. So we see axial symmetry, which is what this is. We see kind of like one side mirroring the other, and lots of organisms, including humans. So we have like a central axis running from the top of our heads to the bottoms of our feet. You can think of your human body as an axial plan as well. There's also something called a central plan, which we'll be talking about in a couple of days. So the Temple of Amun-Ra was the principal religious center dedicated to Amun-Ra and other gods. So this was basically intended to be like a god-vacation resort, a place where the gods could come down from the heavens to be in the mortal plane. So there was also lots of these fixtures within the temple that were intended to serve the gods. There were lots of altars that the priests would regularly supply with offerings for the gods. There was also a sacred lake that resembled kind of like this primeval water that the ancient Egyptians believed existed before creation. So the building of this complex started during the Middle Kingdom, and several successive pharaohs added onto it over the centuries until it became what we currently understand today. So we've seen this term before, hypostyle hall, when we looked at ancient Persia. So a hypostyle hall, to kind of give you a refresher, is basically this complex where you have a lot of these columns that are really close together, and they're held together by these stone lintels. So arches do not exist yet. The arches that we typically see in architecture today, those were invented by the Romans. So that's a couple of thousand years into the future from here. So post and lintel all the way around. Typically, especially when you're using stone, your lintels can only be so wide before they crack under their own weight, which is why the columns are so closely packed together. So it's really the invention of arches with the ancient Romans that we're starting to see these larger and more open interior spaces. But for now, if we have a roof, then the columns are going to be very close together. So there's a couple of complications that arise when you have these very tightly packed columns in an area, and that is that it's going to be very dark because you have all these columns that are tightly arranged together, and you have a roof. So one of the innovations that architects developed was something called the clerestory window. So the way that this is achieved is that you have these differing heights of columns here. So you had some tall ones in the middle and some relatively shorter ones flanking the sides, and you left these areas between the roofs open so that light can enter the space. This is called a clerestory window. We're going to be seeing this again when we talk about churches in a couple of thousand years. What's super amazing about these columns is that a lot of them are in quite remarkable condition, particularly the ones that are closest to the lintels on the very top. These are the ones that have escaped a lot of the impact of the elements, including things like solar radiation and sandstorms. So there's actually some remnants of paint on these sections of the building that give us a hint as to what this complex might have looked like fully painted. So the tall columns have these capitals or column toppers that are in the shape of papyrus, which you'll recall is this very important plant to the ancient Egyptians. It's used to create the papyrus paper. It grows in the Nile. And then we see lotus bud motifs on the shoulder capitals here. So you can see the lotus motif here. So the entrance of this temple was marked by this massive pylon gateway. Again, it's really difficult to convey scale when you look at this image, but this wall is around 40 feet tall, and these are like average-sized palm trees to give you a sense of the scale. So these gateways are extremely tall. I try to include images too that have people in them to give you a sense of the scale here. These pylons were intended to basically narrow the entrance as much as possible. You'll notice that it's extremely narrow in comparison to the size of the entire monument itself. And they were also intended to create a division between the world of chaos and the world of controlled peace inside of the temple. It's very much like how a church has this kind of like more enclosed space that tends to be more controlled and more kind of like intentional in terms of what is being presented to you. The entrance to the temple is flanked by several sphinx-like figures right here.
You, just you, building your app on base 44.
And of course, these sphinxes are oftentimes associated with protection. We saw these similar kinds of human-animal hybrid figures guarding the entrances to citadels in ancient Mesopotamia as well. You might recall the Lamassu. So again, here's an aerial view right here of the Temple of Amun-Ra in Hypostyle Hall. Again, here are some human figures to give you a sense of scale, and there is the remains of the artificial sacred lake. So many of these columns were covered in these reliefs that were several thousand years ago covered in paintings, many of which had narratives documenting the achievements of the pharaohs that commissioned them, as well as narratives associated with gods. Our next piece is the mortuary temple of Queen Hatshepsut. So Luxor is relatively close to Karnak. This temple was carved remarkably directly out of the side of a massive sandstone cliff. So think of this structure as a massive subtractive sculpture. So when you look at it from an aerial view, you get a sense of the scale of it. Again, these are human figures to give you a sense of how large it is. And it was basically this thing that was subtracted out of this cliffside. A lot of art historians mention this repeated motif of these long horizontal bars interrupted by these like shorter vertical lines in the cliff side that we're seeing, like this natural motif, and how the artist might have intended to reflect that same motif in the arrangement of these terraces right here and the columns that are supporting them. So there's 3 terraces that are connected by 2 ramps. So these terraces were originally planted with these beautiful gardens with exotic trees and fruits. It was supposed to be this very green space. And the temple itself, as are many temples that are commissioned by pharaohs, were decorated with extensive reliefs that were basically narrating their achievements and telling everybody how cool they were. So Hatshepsut is the first woman recorded in our history in terms of like being a person with significant achievements. So she was a pharaoh queen. Basically, she was married to Tutmos, and he died relatively early in his reign. And his son with another woman, typically pharaohs were polygamous, they had several wives. So he had a wife with a son that was like 7 or 8 years old. He was not old enough to rule. So Hatshepsut, who was his principal wife, ruled in his place. And she ended up ruling for about 20 years. So she took her role very seriously. She oftentimes commissioned portraits of herself in these elements that are associated with pharaohs, including this false beard and the Nemes headdress. Interestingly as well, she oftentimes has herself depicted with these more male or androgynous attributes. Oftentimes too in the inscriptions, she is referred to as His Highness. So Tutmosis III, who was her nephew, actually, like sometime later in his reign, had a lot of her statues destroyed. So you'll notice in this particular statue right here of Hatshepsut that it's been heavily damaged. This was actually pieced together from a bunch of rubble that a bunch of archaeologists then had to piece together. So it is very likely that Hatshepsut's statues were victims of iconoclasm, which is again this deliberate destruction or misshapening of statues, typically to insult the person or the ideas that they're depicting. In this particular image here, we see Hatshepsut kneeling with these offering jars. So pharaohs never knelt to mortals, they only knelt to gods. So we can infer based on that information that she is offering something to the gods. So there were several of these red granite statues or remains of them that were found throughout the temple complex. There were also several statues of Hatshepsut as like basically almost like cosplaying other gods. So there's one of her representing Osiris, for example. There's another one of her representing, I think, Horus. So basically she is imposing her image upon many of these important figures in the temple, which is further exemplifying her power. There's also an interesting obelisk over in the Temple of Amun-Ra, which is the AP artwork that we just covered. An obelisk is basically a giant rectangular prism that is topped with a pyramid. We see them a lot in ancient Egyptian architecture. And this is the top of that what is now felled obelisk, and it depicts Hatshepsut kneeling before Amun. And she is basically, like some archaeologists have interpreted her as being like coronated or crowned by him. Our next piece is from the Amarna period, which is kind of like a deviation period that is pretty unusual within ancient Egyptian art. So Akhenaten was a bit of an oddball. He basically said, you know what, everybody thinks that there's like many gods, but actually there's only one god. His name is Aten, and he only talks to me. So the priesthood was completely like sanitized. Like he got rid of all of the people that were associated with this pantheon of gods that the ancient Egyptians had followed for thousands of years. It caused this massive uproar, and after his death, the older traditions were eventually reinstated. But during this brief period when Akhenaten was pharaoh, relatively brief within the span of ancient Egyptian history, he basically created what we now refer to as the Amarna style. So he briefly moved the capital of ancient Egypt from Thebes to Amarna, which is why this time is called the Amarna period. And a lot of the artwork from this time is distinctly different from the figurative work, especially that we're seeing in other periods of ancient Egyptian history. For one thing, the figures are a lot more slender. They're almost alien in their depictions. They usually have very large heads and thin limbs. They also have these epicene, kind of like sex ambiguous bodies, these heavily lidded eyes and slack jaws, and these kinds of drooping bellies. Interestingly, too, we see this very unusual scene here, and that is this very intimate scene between Akhenaten, his wife Nefertiti, and their 3 daughters. You might recall previously in our curriculum, we saw this image of king and cowering queen, and there's some gestures and indications of affection here, but you're not really seeing these figures look at each other. They're still very separate from one another. They're not interacting in a way that we would in like the modern Western world associate with intimacy. But when we look at this image here of Akhenaten, Nefertiti, and the three daughters, like these figures are interacting with their children. We see Akhenaten like placing a kiss on his daughter's face. So this is extremely different from images that we've previously seen in ancient Egyptian artwork. This degree of domesticity that we typically don't see in the ancient world. So the god Aten was typically represented by a sun with a Nemes cobra, and then these rays that were coming out from it that had hands on them, and then there's also this motif of the Ankh. So the Ankh is a symbol that the ancient Egyptians used pretty frequently in their artwork. We're going to see another art piece that uses the Ankh shortly. The Ankh is oftentimes associated with life and vitality. It's also a pretty common erotic symbol, so it's associated with female genitalia. So we have this Ankh pointing towards Nefertiti right here, and then we also have one pointing towards Akhenaten right here. Oftentimes when mummies were embalmed, they had an Ankh placed in their wrappings. It was oftentimes associated with life, and then this ancient Egyptian belief that like when you died, then your soul would come back to life. So you probably all heard of King Tutankhamun, aka King Tut. So historically speaking, most archaeologists don't believe that King Tutankhamun was particularly significant. He became king when he was around 9 years old and died about 10 years later. Most archaeologists think that he had a broken leg that eventually got infected. What was particularly remarkable about King Tutankhamun was the fact that his tomb was found very intact. So basically, all tombs of pharaohs that we know of were looted at some point. You can understand why a lot of these pharaohs were buried with hundreds, if not thousands, of pounds of gold and faience and precious metals. There was a pretty big motivation for tomb robbers to come in and steal stuff, even despite these harsh punishments that were instilled upon grave robbers that were eventually found out. So this tomb is really remarkable in that it had been relatively untouched, and that it was basically in a state where archaeologists could.
I did not think it would tell me that I needed to prep better the day before.
Your lineup needs work. Yeah, it did call me out.
Can you repeat the question?
Right. Ask the question, how can I be more productive this week?
So within seconds, I'm seeing be more productive sounds simple.
Remove friction before it's
Assume more or less that this is the way that things were intended to be when they were buried. Oftentimes when tomb sites are excavated, things have been moved around because the grave robbers basically went through and took all the valuable things and then destroyed the things that were not important to them. So there were several coffins that were surrounding Tutankhamun's body. There is a diagram right here. So there were several of these larger coffin cases, or caskets rather. Coffins are the more body-shaped ones. So there were several caskets that were kind of nested in one inside the other, like Matryoshka dolls. And then there were three of these more like coffin-shaped, like body-shaped items here. And then the innermost coffin was made of around 500 pounds of solid gold. One of my students did a calculation as to how much this is worth, and it was in the millions of dollars. So the innermost coffin is 6.5 feet long, and there's this winged vulture motif that is surrounding the torso right here. These are representing protective goddesses that are protecting Tutankhamun's body as he travels to the afterlife. There's also two more goddesses that are shown here with wings that are a little bit difficult to see that are flanking each other on the lid. One of the most common motifs associated with pharaohs is the crook and flail. These are oftentimes like the equivalent of like a scepter. They represent the divine right to rule. And of course, we're seeing the false beard, Nemes headdress, and cobra motifs that we oftentimes see associated with pharaohs. So there was even like another mask that was on top of Tutankhamun's body that was this one right here. This is the death mask. So it only has the head and shoulders portion. So this death mask was also solid gold. It was placed directly over the body inside the innermost coffin. So there was this beautiful lapis lazuli turquoise and carnelian that was used to inlay what we see as the color on this death mask here. The craftsmanship is just absolutely astounding, which is interesting because Tutankhamun's body was not preserved particularly well. These are a couple of reconstructions of what King Tutankhamun might have looked like in life. You could understand that, like, because he is so famous and this discovery around 100 years ago was so significant, that there's been a lot of international intrigue around, like, the mysteries of Tutankhamun and the things that have been found inside of his tomb. So there's been a lot of remarkable things that have been found inside this tomb. Among them, almost 130 walking sticks. So forensic evidence shows that Tutankhamun had either a congenital defect or an injury that resulted in a chronic illness that required him to use a cane. There's also some images inside of the tomb that suggested that Tutankhamun shot arrows while he was sitting, which is unusual. There are also two caskets found inside of Tutankhamun's tomb that contain the fetuses of what many inside of the tomb that suggested that Tutankhamun shot arrows while he was sitting, which is unusual. Or 130 walking sticks. So forensic evidence shows that Tutankhamun had either a congenital defect or an injury that resulted in a chronic illness that required him to use a cane. There's also some images inside of the tomb that suggested that Tutankhamun shot arrows while he was sitting, which is unusual. There are also 2 caskets found inside of Tutankhamun's tomb that contained the fetuses of what many archaeologists suspect were his children. So, like many other hereditary rulers in ancient Egypt, Tutankhamun was likely the result of incest. And there's some evidence that he had these 2 ill-fated fetuses with his half-sister. So DNA evidence is still emerging regarding these lineages of ancient pharaohs. We were able, like remarkably, to get DNA samples from these remains because the bodies are still so well preserved after thousands of years. So that's the next step that archaeologists and like forensic experts have been working on, is figuring out like who is whose mom / uncle / whatever. These family trees are depressingly tangled. This is our last piece in the Egypt unit. It's called The Last Judgment of Hu-Nefer. So this particular narrative right here was one of many that was in a Book of the Dead. So a Book of the Dead was a common provision that was buried with important people as a sort of like how-to guide to successfully get into the afterlife. So the ancient Egyptians believed, again, that when a person died, then their soul would go on this journey and then re-inhabit the body and then would be able to live out in eternal bliss in the afterlife. The only problem, though, is that to get there, you had to go through several trials, many of which were basically assessments of the person's character in life to basically say, like, only good people can go into the afterlife. So this little how-to book, in this particular instance, shows a particularly famous part of the narrative. And that is when the person to be judged is brought to a court by Anubis, who is this god of embalming. He has a body of a man and the head of a jackal. You'll notice that he's carrying an ankh right here. And he basically brings the person to be judged, who in this case is Hu-Nefer right here, to these scales. So on one side of the scales is the feather of truth, or Mut, on one side, and then the person's heart is placed on the other side of the scale. So Thoth, who is a god of writing, he has the head of an ibis, is basically writing down stuff as it happens. So if the heart is heavier than the feather of Mut, then the person is thought to have sinned in their lifetime. Their heart is heavy with sin and wrongdoing. So in that case, it's game over. The chimeric god Amit will eat your heart and you are not able to go into the afterlife. However, if your heart is lighter than the feather of truth, then you pass the test. You are led by Horus to Osiris, who is the king of the gods and the king of the underworld. He is oftentimes shown with his bowling pin hat and this green or black skin. And he's sitting here on his throne over here. So a couple of things about this narrative is that we see figures more than once in the same image. So we have Anubis right here, the jackal-headed god, shown here, and then there's also a smaller version of him shown here. So this is not to suggest that there are like 2 Anubises and that one is like slightly smaller than the other. It's to show that like this is one part of the narrative right here, and then this is another part of the narrative right here, and that this is another part of the narrative here. So we also see Hu-Nefer shown more than once. We have him shown here and then over here. So this is called a continuous narrative. It's when we see the same figures appearing multiple times in the same image. So we also saw this potentially in the Standard of Ur in the Mesopotamian unit. The figures are also in twisted perspective, which is fairly typical of ancient Egyptian artwork. We have the body twisted in such a way that you're communicating a composite image of the human figure, even if the arrangement is not something that we would see in nature.
This quiz reveals your dream career in 11 questions. Just answer the fun and quirky questions, and it'll show you your personality type and give you a ton of personalized career options.
So here is the Last Judgment in full. These little dudes up here are basically gods that are presiding over the events, and then these are hieroglyphs that are narrating what is happening. So this is an interesting video on Tutankhamun and some like contextual evidence of his tomb that suggests that it was rushed. Oftentimes pharaohs would spend their entire lives preparing for their deaths. Like as soon as they ascended to the throne, they started figuring out their burial plans so that they had a contingency plan for getting into the afterlife successfully. In this video, the narrator explores the concept of Tutankhamun dying long before people thought he would. So they basically took the tomb, this is what they theorized, they took a tomb of what was supposed to be like a minor queen and like really quickly modified it to accommodate Tutankhamun and his body. So there's lots of evidence of shortcuts. So we don't really talk about the first millennium in ancient Egypt, which is kind of a shame because there's so much interesting stuff that is happening. For one thing, dynasties are persisting in the first millennium after the New Kingdom, but they're not exercising nearly as much power as what we saw in the New Kingdom. We're also seeing this layering of civilizations that we saw in Mesopotamia. We see lots of people coming into Egypt. Again, like you heard about the Nile Delta and all that awesome land. People are going to want that. They're going to want to access that. So we see the Nubians come in from the south. So the Nubians are kind of like these people that were like more Central African in nature, whereas the ancient Egyptians were kind of a mixture between sub-Saharan Africans and people that were living in the Mediterranean. So what's interesting is that when you see narrative images from the times that the Nubians are occupying ancient Egypt, you can see physical differences between the figures, particularly in skin color. We also have the Assyrians occupying ancient Egypt for a time, and then of course the Greeks and Romans. So If anybody here has ever been to the Getty, you have probably seen these portrait images. These are remarkable finds. We do not have that much painting from ancient Rome because they were painted on wooden surfaces, and wood tends to rot in a Mediterranean climate, which is very unfortunate. However, there were a significant number of Romans that occupied ancient Egypt, and there were a lot of people in ancient Egypt that were of mixed Roman and Egyptian descent. And we can see those the results of these lineages pretty clearly in the portraits and the variety of people that we're seeing. We're also seeing this hybridization of burial practices. So a lot of Romans chose to be buried in a very Egyptian way, but instead of having this idealized portrait on the surfaces of their sarcophagi, they had these portraits that were painted to be very lifelike and like resemble what the person looked like in life. So there's kind of like this interesting hybridization of cultural norms that we're seeing when Romans are occupying ancient Egypt. And I wish we could talk more about it in the curriculum because it's fascinating. To our second part of the Ancient Mediterranean unit,